Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Coming up on the program today, fourth round of talks of Russia-Ukraine conflict takes place.
At least one person killed and 3 others injured after Russian shelling on a residential building in Kyiv. Plus, Ukrainian president warns Russian attacks could expand to neighboring countries and urges NATO to impose a no-fly zone.
Welcome again. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
And I'm Millicent Walker. A day after Moscow escalated its offensive by shutting areas perilously close to the Polish border, besieged Ukrainians hope renewed diplomatic talks with Russia might open the way for more civilians to evacuate.
That's right, but as the talks go on, Russia has continued its assault with forces attacking from the north and south of the country. And the assault on Kyiv also continues with at least one person dying during a strike on a block of flats. Russian forces are attempting to encircle and cut off the Ukrainian capital, with troops now moving towards the city from multiple positions.
Let's look at key events so far from day 19 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Russian and Ukrainian representatives resume talks in a bid to end weeks of fighting. It's the fourth round of talks, and the Ukrainian president's office hints at progress, saying Ukraine is pushing for an immediate ceasefire. But Russia continues its bombardment of many Ukrainian cities, with one person killed in a strike on a block of flats in the capital, Kyiv. Antonov Airport in northern Kyiv has been hit by Russian shelling. Ukrainian authorities say 2 people have died and 7 injured. Mariupol, a key Ukrainian port city, is also said to be suffering constant shelling, bombing and some street battles. Thousands of civilians have been trapped there for nearly 2 weeks, surrounded by Russian troops firing rockets and shells, which have destroyed many buildings. City officials say there's a desperate need for food, water, medicine and electricity. According to reports, a pregnant woman and her baby have died after Russia bombed a maternity hospital in Mariupol, where she was meant to give birth last week. The EU says over 2,400 civilians have died in Mariupol since Russia invaded.
I want to announce that we are finalizing the adoption of a fourth strong package of sanctions, a new package of sanctions. This package that will be approved by written procedure by the Council of Foreign Affairs Ministers will include new measures against Russian trade, market access, membership in international financial institutions, crypto assets, export of luxury goods, and targeting of steel and energy sectors.
Ukraine says it will try to evacuate trapped civilians through 10 humanitarian corridors today, including from towns near the capital, Kyiv, and in the eastern region of Luhansk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warns the Russian attacks could expand to neighboring countries and urges NATO to impose a no-fly zone. He also says the main task of his delegation at talks with the Russian counterpart was to arrange a meeting between himself and Russian President Vladimir Putin. More than 2.6 million people have fled into neighboring countries since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of the country on the 24th of February 2022.
The VOA's Anna Chernikova is in western Ukraine. She joins us now. Anna, well, thanks for staying with us and holding up for us with the reporting in Ukraine. How are you today? And when we last spoke on Ivano-Frankivsk, that city had been hit by some Russian shelling. What's the situation over there? What was the situation over the weekend and now?
Hello. Well, it's quite safe still here in Western Ukraine. There were a couple of shellings over the weekend. As you probably heard, the Lutsk airport, Ivano-Frankivsk airport, and Lviv. Lviv airport and not airport, sorry, Lviv training and humanitarian center, and one of the towns in Lviv with military, the base of military purposes, and actually this little town is just 20 kilometers away from Poland border. So we consider, I mean, here in Ukraine, people consider it as a certain message from Putin and certain certain revenge, because he didn't exceed any. He didn't get any success in other regions of Ukraine.
Anna, as well, this is the third week of this war. Are there, in terms of the new round of talks we're hearing, how hopeful are Ukrainians?
Well, we are informed by the government and by certain European leaders that it seems that Russia is actually ready for more precise talks. Hopefully this would be the case. Again, it's third week now, and as we can see, all previous talks didn't really help much. At least we hope that talks on Mariupol humanitarian corridor will go on, because Mariupol is still not a safe place for evacuation, so no evacuation happened over all this time.
And, you talk about Mariupol. We know that it's been one of the worst affected, especially with civilians trapped, lack of food supplies. Tell us about the hope for any evacuation for those there.
Today it was supposed to, again, today is the third day after another talks, the latest talks, when it was confirmed that Mariupol could be evacuated, but unfortunately it didn't happen because Russian military continued the shelling and didn't let people out, and didn't actually let humanitarian buses in the town. So today it was another hope that at least humanitarian vehicles with food, medications and water would be allowed in. And it was planned that these vehicles would take people out of the town. For the moment, what we know is that vehicles were not allowed in, but more than 160 civilian cars were allowed out of the town. So at least some people happened to get out of Mariupol today. But again, humanitarian corridor didn't really work this time as well.
It's been hard to keep up with the humanitarian corridors, Anna. But let's just circle back to the meeting that's going on right now, the one that the delegates from both sides, Ukraine and Russia, are supposed to have tomorrow. What hopes are there that, there could be some resolution of some sort with the conversations?
Well, it's really not a lot of hope regarding the ceasefire. Unfortunately, at least this is what here in Ukraine people are expecting. Hopefully that, again, green corridors for humanitarian help would be agreed, and finally full-scale evacuation could happen, because problem is not only in Mariupol, but also Kherson, Sumy, Kharkiv region, and the city of Kharkiv as well, and obviously Kiev region. So for now, we haven't had any day of really 100% safe evacuation happen. So I think this would be again the main topic for the negotiations. And as you mentioned, meetings of two presidents, well, not really big hope for the moment here, at least in Ukraine, but we'll see. Maybe they would agree on something.
Yeah, well, I was asking about, the meeting between the delegates of both sides, but then you also spoke about the possible meeting between President Volodymyr Zelensky and President Vladimir Putin. Do they really seem to want to talk about, ending this war?
Well, our president, the Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelensky, he is ready to talk, but again, he is ready to talk on the equal points, you know. So, to be honest, at least according to the official statements by Russian side, it's not really big hope for, you know, the equal conversation between two of them without any ultimatums and so on and so forth. So if you ask me as what are these, you know, hopes inside the country, not big hopes for that. But again, we hope for diplomacy, that diplomacy still could prevail in this situation because too many people suffer, too many civilians suffer.
VOA's Anna Chernikova, thank you, and continue to stay safe.
Yeah, and it's been nearly 3 weeks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. Scenes of destruction can be seen across this vast country. More than 2.5 million refugees have fled their homeland since the Russian aggression began on February 24th, according to the UN.
Well, talks between the two sides continue, with Ukraine pushing for more immediate ceasefire. To speak about the prospect of these talks and more, we have joining us her senior professional lecturer and distinguished diplomat in residence, School of International Service, Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne. Ambassador, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Welcome. A spokesman for the Ukrainian president's office is hinting at progress at the fourth round of talks, saying Ukraine is pushing for an immediate ceasefire. Do you see this happening? And do you think Ukraine is perhaps desperate for the ceasefire, seeing the level of destruction so far?
Well, certainly it's encouraging that they've agreed to talk again tomorrow. But I don't think we're on the eve of agreement between the two sides. There's a tremendous amount of difference between both of them. I think there is a big interest in having a humanitarian ceasefire, if you would say, agreeing on the routes for civilians to leave the combat areas. But I believe it's going to take quite a while before we get to a point of agreement between the two sides. The gaps are just very significant.
And that's because of how far things have gone, isn't it? But following Russia's bombardment, especially its missile attack on a military base near Poland on Sunday, you consider that a mistake, or you think that it speaks to something more to come? Poland's Deputy Foreign Minister is calling that action an attempt to threaten NATO.
I think it was clearly a warning to NATO and others that the Russians consider all of Ukraine an area for military activity, and they were sending a signal because there are a lot of supplies coming in from the NATO countries for Ukraine, and the Russians are suffering because of those supplies coming in. That has strengthened the capacity of the Ukrainian soldiers, who are fighting very effectively, and so I think they were trying to send a signal there.
Well, on the back of that is the Ukrainian president also warning that Russian attacks could expand to neighboring countries, urging for the no-fly zone, which he has repeatedly called for. What are the possibilities of NATO imposing a no-fly zone?
Well, right now, I think it's pretty clear that there is not a consensus in NATO for imposing a no-fly zone. There are a number of other ideas out there, including a humanitarian cover, in a sense, for the western part of Ukraine. But I think most NATO governments are focused on trying to provide additional weaponry, defensive weaponry especially, to the Ukrainians, rather than having a no-fly zone. And they're talking about air defense systems that could be brought in. But I'm sure they're looking at other weapons. As you know, they were not keen on the idea of Polish MiGs flying to a U.S. base in Germany and then going to Ukraine, because they thought that might spark a broader conflict. And I think that's the same problem with the no-fly zone. There is not a desire on the NATO side to spread this conflict to other areas, but rather to look at ways in which they can strengthen the Ukrainians as they are resisting the Russians.
What do you say to people who say that Ukraine was goaded into this war and was egged on by the United States and by NATO and has been abandoned by these allies that are supposed to be by its side as it faces Russia?
Well, I think if we look back at the history, it's clear that Russia just kept pushing and pushing themselves and trying to find excuses and making up excuses to come in, including the very ludicrous charges by Putin that this was a Nazi government in Ukraine, headed by a president who was half Jewish. And I think Ukraine was not at all looking for a conflict. They were looking just to maintain their independence, their ability to choose their own leadership and their own future. And Russia decided that this was a war of choice that they'd launched to take. First, we thought maybe just slices of Ukraine, but now it looks like taking control of the country, and at a minimum replacing the current democratically chosen government with a government that is favorable to Russia.
And we are seeing a lot of sanctions to pressure Russia to stop the invasion. But India is considering taking up a Russian offer to buy its crude oil and other commodities, we understand, at discounted prices. What do you make of that move, which suggests that the sanctions might not have, had much impact on Russia?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the sanctions are having an impact in the Russian economy. As we know, economic sanctions take a while, however, to sink in. And one of the dangers with sanctions is that people will seek to go around them. So that means that the United States and others, I think, have to also be willing to act against those who try to bust the sanctions in one way or another. And that at first requires frank dialogue in private with countries who maybe need to do that. As you know, there was a senior level dialogue today between the United States and China that I'm sure was discussing this situation. And I'm sure there are dialogues going on between the United States and India. And of course, India has a long history of non-alignment, and it also has at least half of its weaponry of Russian origin. So there's a long history between India and Russia of a defense relationship.
But in terms of China's posture, what's your take? I mean, the US was saying that Russia has asked for military assistance from China. Of course, China is saying that is disinformation. What do you think?
Well, I think that is being denied now. On the other hand, my hunch is that there probably were conversations, but none of the conversations have actually indicated that the Chinese agreed, even if they were asked to do something. I think China has to think very, very carefully about how it manages this situation. On the one hand, it says it has a very close relationship with Russia. On the other hand, it is very much integrated into the world economy. Its wealth, after all, has come from making and selling things to the rest of the world. That means that there's potentially very, very high costs for China if they mishandle this situation and look like they are siding with the clear aggressor in this case. So I think that the talks today that were taking place between the United States and China are very important, and those dialogues need to continue and to work through what won't be easy, but I hope an acceptable role for China to play as we hopefully move toward a more peaceful situation in Ukraine.
Ambassador Earl Wayne, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Appreciate your analysis, and we'll hope you join us again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Well, you're watching Channels Television, and our one-hour coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is still ahead, though. The UK says no limit on Ukrainian refugees allowed into the country under its new visa scheme. We'll have more in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, some Nigerians who are still trapped in Ukraine have been speaking out about their ordeal, especially those in the Russian-occupied city of Kherson.
Jerry Kenny is one of them, and he is the head of the International Students' Union in the city. He says they are not allowed to exit the city that has been under attack.
Right, Ukraine says that Russians are pressing the regional council to agree to a referendum on Kherson's independence from the country.
Now we are not allowed to gain exits. That's the green corridor, because it has been captured by the Russians. So they are preventing the Ukrainian army's invasions. So that's why there's no green corridor. And moreover, the bombing, the sounds, and the explosion is really, really terrible. And now, in terms of no provisions, medical aid are limited because they attend to the casualties in the hospitals first, because they are taken as the priority. So for you that are getting sick with cold, some little things that can transfer to something else, then you have no options than to stay indoor and look for possible means to help yourself in terms of treatment. It has been a very terrible situation, and I've been doing this all alone until 2 days back, where some NGOs contacted me, because I stopped receiving calls from people, because everybody just call you. They ask for how are you doing, when you know the situation is critical, and nobody's doing anything. So for now, I would say there's some improvement in terms of the people that are coming in board to see how they can evacuate us here from Kherson.
We're praying the help gets to Jerry and the other Nigerians who are stuck in Kherson. Ambassador Abdullahi Shehu is Nigeria's ambassador to Russia. He joins us from Moscow. Ambassador, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you very much, Amarachi.
And I know you're keeping up with developments in Ukraine. So what are you hearing about the situation in Kherson and what's being done to evacuate citizens who are there?
Well, it's untrue to say that nobody is doing anything about the situation in Kherson. Yesterday, my colleague, the Nigerian ambassador in Ukraine, discussed with me the situation in Ukraine, and the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs directed me to contact the Russian authorities to seek for assistance for Nigerian students that are stuck in Kherson. We swam into action with immediate effect, even though it was on a Sunday, and we were informed that some humanitarian agencies are providing food, water, etc., and we were advised on how to inform our citizens to take advantage of the humanitarian aid that was being provided. So even yesterday, when we got to know about this, a list of 32 students, majority Nigerians, was sent to us. And I personally spoke to Jerry, who had just spoken on this program, to explain to him the steps that the Nigerian government, particularly through the Nigerian embassy in Ukraine and the Nigerian embassy in Moscow, to try to evacuate them out of Kherson. This is not something that will happen instantly. We need to engage with the authorities to develop a strategy as to where and how they are going to evacuate, or we are going to evacuate our citizens. So for now, this is where we are, and we hope that in the next 1 day or less, we will get a green light as to how our students will be assisted. But 1 hour ago, I just spoke with the student leader and informed him on the progress on our discussion with the authorities over here.
So, Ambassador, I guess you're saying talks are ongoing with regards to the situation in Kherson. But just a few days ago, we understand there were warning shots fired on residents there, and this was after some of them staged a demonstration against Russian occupation. So essentially, it is a dangerous situation for them. But what can you tell them as to how close, indeed, that they can get a response? And there's also complaints of lots of food supplies that they don't seem to have access to any longer.
Well, you want me to repeat myself. I have already explained to you that this report came to us yesterday, and the Honorable Minister directed me to act immediately, and we have reached out to the Russian authorities. And they have also explained to us how they can get relief materials within the city. I am not in question. I act on the report provided to me, and I have been in touch with our students over there. Today I spoke with the student leader at the Maritime Academy in Kherson about 2 or 3 times today. And as I told you earlier on, I even spoke to Jerry yesterday and explained to him the situation and what efforts we are making to assist. It is unthinkable that any country will imagine its citizens suffering anywhere and that country will be asleep or will not do anything. This is far from the truth. And as you know, I'm collaborating with my colleague in Ukraine to ensure that our citizens are evacuated as soon as possible.
Ambassador, thank you, for all the analysis you've been having. You've been the most accessible of all the ambassadors, Nigerian ambassadors in the region. But as to, Russia now, over 5,000 sanctions have already been imposed by Western countries. How are people coping with these sanctions? Is Russia beginning to feel the impact of the sanctions imposed?
Well, thank you very much for giving me a public pass mark. I did not know that I have gotten to that stage. Well, with respect to the sanctions, as you know, there is no country in the world, no matter how powerful, that sanctions can be imposed on it and it will not feel the impact of the sanctions. And particularly in the current situation, I think this is by far the most comprehensive sanctions ever imposed on any country in the world. Nevertheless, I could see that the Russian authorities are taking steps, adopting measures, enacting regulations with a view to cushioning the effects of the sanctions, with a view also to improving some of their systems so that they are self-reliant. Well, perhaps where we can think of the impact is particularly with respect to Nigeria and Russia relations in the area of what commodities we gain from Russia. As you know, Russia is a major producer of wheat and potassium, and this is likely to impact on Nigeria's economy. In the area of oil production, you know, Nigeria is an oil-producing country. On the positive side, it would look like the rising price of oil will be an advantage in terms of added revenue to Nigeria. However, we may need to sustain the level of our production to be able to take advantage of this. But we are not saying that we are happy that this situation has created a situation where the oil price is rising. We want a situation where there is stability in the oil market. We want a situation where there is stability all over the world so that the world can live peacefully together.
Ambassador Abdullahi Shehu, Nigeria's ambassador to Russia, joining us from Moscow. Thank you so much. We hope that we would hear good news with regards to those in Kherson and their speedy evacuation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your effective coverage. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the government has confirmed that there will be no limit to the number of Ukrainian refugees who can live with the UK host families under a new visa scheme. It is hoped tens of thousands of displaced people will benefit from the Homes of Ukraine refugee scheme. Hosts will receive about £350 a month as a thank you from the government.
Sure, they'll be happy to hear that. Health Secretary Sajid Javid, in an interview with the BBC, said there could be no cap on the number of people who can be supported through this scheme. Meanwhile, a group of 21 Ukrainian children have arrived in the UK to undergo life-saving cancer treatments on the NHS.
The other scheme that you just referred to is the one for hosting a Ukrainian family, and that will, as you say, go live this week. So I think having this online process where the individuals with Ukrainian passports and their details are checked against databases and other information that we have is right. And the reason, by the way, we need these checks is that we know already from intelligence reports that there are extremist groups and other organizations, extremist organizations that are operating in the region in and around Ukraine. And it is right that we carry out some basic checks. And if anyone wants a reminder of the lengths that Putin will go to infiltrate the UK, let's not forget what happened in 2018. And I remember as Home Secretary having to deal with the aftermath of the nerve agent attack in Salisbury right here on British soil.
London correspondent Juliana Laika joins us now for more on this. Juliana, great to see you. Michael Gove is expected to speak about the UK plan to house Ukrainian refugees in people's homes. What more do we know about that?
Yes, good afternoon, Amarachi. Well, Michael Gove, the Minister for Levelling Up, is still speaking with parliamentarians, outlining the details of this new scheme that's been launched today. This is basically the second visa route for Ukrainians who have fled the conflict to coming to the UK. We know that the family route has been heavily criticised for its scale and its speed. Since the 4th of March, only 4,000 visa applications have been issued to Ukrainians. So now this Homes for Ukraine is an idea where British citizens give up their beds or their spare bedroom to Ukrainians. We're expecting tens of thousands of people to take up this offer. Even though it was launched today, there are still very many holes, and there was lots of back and forth between opposition MPs and Michael Gove, because unlike countries within the EU who have taken the lion's share of refugees, we know that Poland have taken over 1.5 million, other neighbours tens of thousands. Britain hasn't done that, and other EU countries are also allowing Ukrainians to come in without any visa, and they're offering 3 years of stay. But Britain still want this to be documented and official. It is not an open door policy, but what we're expecting is that over the course of the coming days, more people will be welcomed, but you will have to make sure you have a biometric check.
And Juliana, how is the match being done? I mean, the match between the match of refugees and homes that they're going to. How many people are willing to give up their homes or open their homes, to these refugees coming in? And is there a process to this? Do people have to register? Indicates that they're willing to have refugees join them?
Yes, there is a process. Of course, this is Britain, so again, there is still lots of bureaucracy. So the website is open. Any individual across Britain who wants to give up their home, although you will have to be vetted, you have to be a British citizen or at least have a citizenship. You can apply to be a sponsor, but, and again, this is another detail, you have to make sure you name the individual Ukrainian you want to house. So lots of individuals are having to go through third parties or agencies, churches, community groups, mosques, to try and identify this individual. And then the Ukrainian individual or family also have to be vetted by the British government. So the headline, Amarachi, is that Britain has got this new scheme, but how effective is it going to be? Are they going to be lifting some of these really rigid restrictions, which we can see other European countries are not doing, and they are having to take the brunt of this? But there are lots of red lines. But according to Michael Gove just now, hopefully over the next coming days, that will become less restricted and more refugees can start coming into the country to a warm welcome, he says, though it is pretty freezing here.
And Juliana, considering what happened before now, Liberal Democrat leader has called for Home Secretary Priti Patel to be sacked over handling of the Ukrainian refugee crisis. Is this a popular view in England?
Yes, I would say that the Home Secretary Priti Patel has been under fierce criticism for some time now. There are still issues with the evacuation, the last-minute evacuation of Afghanistan, and so many Afghanis who are in this country who are stuck in pretty dilapidated conditions and hotels where they're not being looked after properly. And now, of course, we've got this issue. And Sir Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, has led the calls to ask for her resignation. I quote, he said, she met desperation with delays, crisis with confusion, and pain with paperwork. And there have been some suggestions that her hardline approach has also been condemned by cabinet ministers who want this to be more swift. Even Prime Minister Boris Johnson, when he's out and about speaking to the press, has created a much more calmer, softer, empathetic tone to the tone that we're used to seeing from Priti Patel. But she's usually under lots of criticism for this hardline Brexiteer, closed border a manifesto policy, which is what won this government this big majority in the first place.
And Juliana, also, we heard a group of 21 children arrived the UK, undergo life-saving cancer treatment. Tell us about how they're doing, if you know, and about their families. Will they also be able to join them in the UK as well?
Yes, this is a wonderful story. I think British government ministers are going about just saying how proud they are of Britain's humanitarian effort. They believe that they have led the world really in coming to the safety, not necessarily the refugees, but in other aspects of humanitarianism. They've been doing so. This is one of those areas, a group of NHS doctors led by oncologists at the University Hospital Southampton and Birmingham Children's Hospital flew to Poland on Sunday morning to evacuate 21 Ukrainian cancer patients, all ranging from the age of a baby to about 18 years old, to undergo life-saving treatment here in the UK. They have come with their family members. They are entitled, I believe, to stay for up to a year, but Sajid Javid, the health secretary, said that they can extend that stay. And that's all we know, but we know that they are being treated across the country. But Britain is doing as much as they can. However, this storm about how many refugees they've taken in is just shocking, but I don't think anybody was expecting Britain to behave any differently.
And Juliana, it was just, I think, a couple of months ago that the UK lifted all COVID restrictions, and we're still in the middle of a pandemic. So will there be protocols for these Ukrainians who are arriving in the UK, and what will happen after that?
Goodness, that's a very good question, Amarachi. It's so interesting that before the 4th of March, we were inundated with discussions about COVID, and they appear to have evaporated. There was no mention of COVID-19 in those protocols when I was listening in to Michael Gove. But of course, there have to be these extra added benefits. £350 a month for a sponsor is just not enough to look after the welfare and the needs of people that are fleeing war. So I believe £10,000 per individual will be paid to local councils so they can ensure that individuals have free access to the NHS, including mental support and trauma support. Children will also be able to go into schools. I believe Marks and Spencer's and John Lewis and Tesco are amongst the private sector offering jobs and training for individuals that are coming. But no mention of COVID-19 just yet, but I'm sure that was probably mentioned in the Palace of Westminster by one MP.
Well, Juliana, it's still a developing story. You let us know when what happens after with those kids already arriving today. Thank you for bringing us up to speed on this.
Thank you.
Military
I was just going to say, staying in the United Kingdom. A military expert, Justin Bronx, says an attack on a military base near Ukraine's border with Poland is a signal from Russia that the supply of equipment and personnel from the West is a legitimate target once it crosses into the conflict zone.
That's right. On Sunday, that attack on the Yavoriv International Center for Peacekeeping and Security, which is just a base 15 miles from the Polish border, has previously hosted NATO military instructors, brought the conflict to the doorstep of the Western Defense Alliance.
Ukraine said 35 people had been killed at the base, while Moscow said up to 180 foreign mercenaries died and a large number of foreign weapons were destroyed.
And some street battles.
This is Russia making its first serious attempt to interdict the flow of supplies from the west into western Ukraine and thence towards either Kiev or across towards Kharkiv or Odessa. I don't think it's terribly surprising in the sense that, and it's not even particularly escalatory really, because there was always the understanding in the West that the moment these supplies or volunteers crossed into Ukraine, they were in a war zone and part of a conflict, which is why there's been quite a lot of care to hand things over kind of on the border or on the Polish side of the border. It's definitely symbolic insofar as it is emphasizing that this activity is considered a legitimate target once it's in Ukraine. But I don't think it's a huge escalation. And it's also worth noting that it may partly be less about causing damage up front and more about making those resupply and training activities more inefficient by forcing them to disperse and not having them in these big centralized locations where they can and will be hit.
Still ahead on the program, US warns China that it will face consequences if it helps Russia evade sanctions in its invasion of Ukraine. Stay with us.
Welcome back. Russia's defense ministry says 20 people have been killed, 28 wounded after a Ukrainian missile with a cluster charge exploded in the city of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. The ministry provided no evidence, and Ukraine has denied launching such an attack.
Pro-Russian separatists who control parts of Ukraine's Donetsk region said earlier that a child was among those hit in the alleged strike, and they accused Kiev of committing a war crime. Ukraine has denied suggestions it would try to recapture the eastern cities of Donetsk and Luhansk under the control of Russian-backed forces since 2014 by force.
Well, Ukraine and its allies have previously accused Russia of planning false flag operations to create pretexts for further military offensives against Ukraine. Now, the United States has issued a stern warning to China, saying Beijing will face consequences if it helps Russia evade sanctions in its invasion of Ukraine. Unnamed U.S. officials reportedly told multiple news outlets that Russia had asked China to provide military assistance after it began the invasion.
Well, the Chinese Foreign Ministry accused the U.S. of spreading disinformation. Russia has also denied asking Beijing for military help. The exchanges came before top U.S. and Chinese officials meet in Rome. U.S. media outlets are citing Washington officials saying that Russia has in recent days asked China specifically for military equipment, including drones.
Our Washington correspondent Maria Bird joins us now. Maria, it's great to see you. What were we learning about Russia asking China to provide military assistance after it began the invasion?
The U.S. has stated for quite some time now that they believe that China has been corresponding with Russia. And these two individuals that have provided some intel to the U.S. Clearly have stated that this was due to even drones potentially as being a source of assistance for Russia. So the U.S. has come out pretty strong in stating that they know this is the case, despite the fact that the ambassador to the U.S. from China has also said, even in an interview here recently, that they have not been requested any type of assistance from Russia. So I think at this time it is clear that China and Russia are on the same page as it relates to what they're going to be telling the global community. But the U.S. is going to, as they have been, a leader in kind of the diplomatic relations globally as it relates to the Ukraine-Russia tension there, and they will be kind of unveiling, and I would not be surprised in the coming days if we don't find out some concrete intel that has led to why the U.S. has stated this as it relates to China.
Indeed, it's very interesting because we were hearing unnamed U.S. officials and then China saying it's disinformation and, you know, people wondering where is the evidence of all of that. But we also know that U.S. top officials, also Chinese officials, are meeting in Rome. Can you tell us about what this will be centered on? Definitely Russia-Ukraine war, but what else?
Yes, the U.S. government has, as you said, met a little bit earlier with the Chinese official, the counterpart to Sullivan here in the U.S. To discuss this, to bring forth, to kind of see what is going to be the next steps. But I think that that was not the initial intention of the meeting, but obviously that was definitely put on the table. But I think by tomorrow we should know some additional information. But we will also know as we hear from whether it's the president or the press secretary as to how the U.S. and China's relations will be in the coming weeks and days ahead, because that is going to be a clear indicator as to whether or not China has revealed or come what the U.S. believes is supporting Russia in any way.
So, Maria, the U.S. intends to stop China from throwing a lifeline to Russia. How does it intend to do that without, irking Russia, knowing what's already going on in Ukraine and from preventing that from escalating beyond what already exists on the ground?
Well, we've heard China stating that they are very, disheartened by what's happening to the Ukrainian people, and they are showing some sense of sympathy in that regard. But they have not been very clear on really being clear with Russia that Russia's invasion was unjust. And so I think the U.S. is going to, if we see any sort of economic sanctions, if we see any sort of reduction in trade, if we see any type of contention between the U.S. and China, I think we can all tie that directly to what we've seen over the last couple of days, and specifically what has come out of the meeting in Rome.
Maria, talk to us about some of the impact of these sanctions, especially on Americans. We've been seeing lots of TikTok videos showing, Americans crying out at gas prices. Tell us.
I think that the gas price issue it's quite unfortunate what's happening, obviously, with Russia and Ukraine, and specifically as we look at some of what's been cut off with trade between the U.S. and Russia. Now, we also know that most recently the U.S. has only imported maybe 3 to 5% of oil from Russia. And so looking at that low percentage, is that going to have this type of impact on oil prices? The U.S. has been struggling with some of its, export, import for quite some time now. Inflation has been a major issue for more than 3 to 4 months now. That has been the topic of discussion. And so I think it was expected that we would see inflation not only in prices in grocery stores, but also within gas. We're heading toward the summer months, which typically gas prices go up that time of year anyway. So I think that it's a bit of a stretch to say that it's just directly related to what's happening in some of the discontinuing of trade between the U.S. and Russia.
What about cushioning the effects of, the sanctions on the rest of the world? I mean, if you're imposing sanctions on Russia, a number of things will be affected. Of course, Russia's oil, gas, coal, and all of that wheat would also be affected. Has the U.S. and its other Western allies and NATO also considered cushioning, the impact of these sanctions on Russia, the impact they would have on other countries in the rest of the world?
You're exactly correct. And I think that's why you see in several of the sanctions, the U.S. has done it unilaterally. The U.S. has not had allies in some of their very specific economic sanctions that could potentially impact other parts of the world. Now, the president of the U.S., President Biden, has also said that he knows that in future months, whether or not there's ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, the U.S. will still see economic impacts and still will have effects of these sanctions over the long term. We are, somewhat seeing them today, but definitely within the next 6 months to a year, you will really begin to see that impact. So the real question is, what are some of the stopgaps that have been put in place to try to avoid overarching economic and livelihood impacts between the U.S. and obviously those allies?
Our Washington correspondent Maria Baird, thank you for that update.
Thank you.
All right, more developments now. Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid says that Israel will not be a route to bypass sanctions imposed on Russia by the U.S. and other Western countries as diplomatic talks between Ukraine and Russia resume. Until now, Israel has not joined the Western sanctions against Russia.
During a press briefing earlier today with Slovakian Foreign Minister Ivan Korkek in Bratislava, the Slovak capital, Lapid says Israel will do everything in its power to help mediation efforts to restore peace.
Israel will not be a route to bypass sanctions imposed on Russia by the United States and other Western countries. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel is coordinating the issue together with partners including the Bank of Israel, the Finance Ministry, the Economy Ministry, the Airports Authority, the Energy Ministry, and others.
The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which gathered in a special session to talk about Ukraine, demonstrated their support to the country and COE member states earlier today. Parliamentary Assembly President Tiny Cox called for a minute's silence at the start of the extraordinary session, and members gathered with signs and banners against the war in Ukraine afterwards.
Russia, which is a member of the Council of Europe, along with 46 other states, was suspended February 25 after its military intervention in Ukraine. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was set to address the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, but the intervention didn't happen. Instead, Ukraine's prime minister was due to step in, but that didn't happen either and was postponed to the afternoon.
The Council of Europe was formed after World War II to protect human rights and the rule of law across the continent. It's separate from the European Union.
Our member state, Russia, was, within 3 days after the start of its armed aggression against Ukraine, suspended from its right to be represented in the statutory bodies of the Council of Europe, in this Parliamentary Assembly, and the Committee of Ministers, and later in the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities. The Russian Federation did listen neither to our calls nor to those of the rest of the international community, first and foremost the United Nations. Further possible action has to be examined. That is why I convened this extraordinary session of our Assembly, in which we, representing the remaining 46 member states of the Parliamentary Assembly, will thoroughly investigate the consequences of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine.
More sanctions, more consequence for Russia.
Indeed. That's been our show today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.
I'm Millicent Walker. Have a good evening.